Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Chapter 9 of our Theories of War and Peace lectures. We will have a look today at the third major liberal approach to peace and war. The liberal approach establishing a link between the domestic political regime of the state and its foreign policy behavior, and more specifically, its war or peace proneness. The major theory within this perspective is the so-called democratic peace theory, claiming that democracy is a force for peace. The more democracies, the more peace in the world. The starting point of this democratic peace theory, which was discovered or rediscovered to some extent in the 1980s, which was very, very successful throughout, I would say, 2 decades or so, in the discipline of international relations, which maybe because of this scientific success was also used by politicians, by statesmen, to justify some of their foreign policy actions. We'll come back to this very briefly at the end, and we'll come back to this in details during our second semester course on democracies at war. This democratic peace theory was rediscovered in the 1980s thanks to different empirical researches, different empirical statements that were made roughly after 40 years of Cold War. Indeed, the first statement, what did scholars see when looking at international political relations? They saw that the number of interstate wars after 1945, the number of interstate wars was progressively, gradually, but steadily declining. There were less wars in years 45 to 85 than in previous similar periods, in previous centuries. And this evolution was all the more so significant since the number of states had increased significantly. There were, in 1945, when the UN was created, there were 51 independent states, and at the end of the Cold War, and nowadays, there will be, at the end of the Cold War, there were 159, so 3 times more numerous states independent than 40 years before, 50 years before. You know, I guess, that nowadays there are 193 or 194 independent states members of the United Nations. So a decrease of the number of wars, first empirical statement. The second empirical statement, when looking at the political regimes of the belligerents, of the protagonists involved in wars, the wars that broke out during this 40 years period opposed either non-democratic states to other non-democratic states, or democratic states to non-democratic states. But there were no examples of wars opposing democracies among each other. Examples of non-democracies fighting against other non-democracies are pretty numerous. For instance, China attacked Vietnam in 1979. The USSR intervened in Afghanistan in 1979 too. At the end of 1979, Iraq attacked Iran in 1980. Examples of wars opposing democratic regimes to non-democratic ones are also pretty numerous. Israel versus its various Arab neighbors. India opposed to Pakistan 3 times. The US, of course, involved in Vietnam. Great Britain opposed to Argentina during the Falklands or the Malvinas War. But no example of democratic states waging wars against each other. And the last statement that was made was that the number of democracies, democratic regimes, was also steadily increasing. And statistical quantitative inquiries show that there had been 3 democracies at the very end of the 18th century: the US, France, and the Netherlands. There were 8 at the end of the first half of the 19th century, 13 at the eve of World War I, 29 after World War II, and 54 at the end of the 1980s, at the end of the Cold War, 15-4. You may know that nowadays, according to the American think tank Freedom House, 84 states, so a bit more than 40% of existing states, 84 states are considered to be free states. This is the term used by Freedom House, the think tank. Free states can roughly be considered to be equivalent, of course, to liberal democracies. So given these statements, some scholars came to the conclusion that it was worth wondering whether there was a link between the political regime of a democracy and its somehow peaceful foreign behavior. Is there a link? Despite the realist claim according to which all states are like units, remember Kant was, all states are like units because they are determined by the structure, the anarchical structure and the distribution of power among major states. Is there nevertheless a link between the democratic political regime of a state and its foreign political behavior? Its foreign political behavior in general, or its foreign political behavior towards other democratic states? Is it possible that democracies did establish a separate zone of peace? And if this is the case, how can we explain that democracies do behave differently, either as such or at least when dealing with one another? It is to these questions, ladies and gentlemen, that the so-called democratic peace theory planned to provide ambitions to provide answers, and the questions and the answers form the so-called democratic peace theory. This democratic peace theory basically goes back to Immanuel Kant, the Prussian philosopher of Königsberg, who in 1795 wrote his Perpetual Peace sketch. This is the German edition of various writings, Zum ewigen Frieden, Perpetual Peace. Kant, in this essay, very short essay, I invite you to read it, of course. Kant starts with sharing, at first sight at least, Thomas Hobbes's or Jean-Jacques Rousseau's conception of the state of war among state of nature. At the very beginning, among states, the state of nature is a state of war. At the very beginning of his essay, this is what he wrote. The state of nature among states is one of war. So the state of nature is a state of war. This does not mean always open hostilities. There are not effective wars fought all the time. But this means at least an unceasing threat of war. In other words, he shares the same idea as Thomas Hobbes. According to Thomas Hobbes, you know this, there is a never-ending disposition to go to war. There is always an unceasing threat of war. So at first sight, Kant shares the same starting point as realist philosophers before him, but he immediately introduces the difference. He does not think that this will last eternally. He actually claims that peace is possible. It is possible to move towards peace at the condition that some conditions, precisely, on the condition that some conditions are met. These conditions are called either preliminary articles of the perpetual peace or definitive articles of the perpetual peace. I will focus on the definitive articles, or the definitive, or the major conditions, the structural conditions of perpetual peace, and more specifically on the first one. Kant distinguishes three definitive articles of the perpetual peace. First, according to Kant, I quote, the civil constitution of every state should be republican. So in order for to give peace a chance, to give perpetual peace a chance, to permit perpetual peace to prevail, and therefore to replace the then existing state of war, 1795, when Kant wrote his essay in 1795, the last decade of the 18th century, of course, was the period of the French Revolutionary Wars that were to be followed by the French Napoleonic Wars. So the first condition that must be met is that every state should adopt a republican constitution. The second definitive article claims that in order for peace to prevail, the law of nations should be founded on a federation of free states, And the third condition that must be fulfilled is the following one: the law, I quote, the law of world citizenship shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. I will focus on the first one. The second actually refers to the liberal idea of peace through institutions, a federation, that is to say, an association, we could say an organization of free states, that is to say, of independent states. Kant is not favorable to a supranational entity, he just is favorable to an organization of independent states. So peace through institutions, we saw this in our chapter 8. And the third one, the law of world citizenship shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. Universal hospitality actually means cosmopolitanism, that is to say, peace through free trade. It is Montesquieu's free trade theory. Universal hospitality, that is to say, all the states should welcome trade with other states. So I will focus on the first definitive article. The civil constitution of every state should be a republic. Why then a republic? Why then should a republic, according to Kant, be a peace-prone regime? One conceptual remark, preliminary remark, according to Kant. Kant uses the term republic and not democracy, but it corresponds to what nowadays we would call democracy in the meaning of liberal, representative, indirect democracy, where the citizens elect their representatives and where the governments are dependent, of course, from the popular vote. He uses the term republic because when he wrote his essay at the end of the 18th century, democracy, the term democracy referred to ancient, that is to say, Greek democracy, which was a direct democracy and not an indirect one. So according to Immanuel Kant, a republic favors peace. A republic or democracy is a peace-prone regime because in a democracy, those who take the decision to launch a war are also those who will suffer from the prospective negative consequences of peace. And since Kant is a liberal philosopher, positing the rationality of individuals, the fact for individuals to be able to undertake a rational cost advantage calculation, he claims that rational individuals would not permit, since the government in a democracy depends on the citizens, the rational citizens would not permit their governments to go to war, since they would have themselves to bear the very negative, the prospective negative consequences of war. Let's listen to Immanuel Kant's. I think this excerpt is worth being quoted in details. The Republican Constitution gives a favorable prospect for peace, for perpetual peace. And the reason is this: if the consent of the citizens is required in order to decide that war should be launched, if the consent of citizens is required, and he puts between brackets, in this constitution, this cannot but be the case. By definition, in a democracy, citizens basically determine the policy, and in this case, the foreign policy of their state. So if the consent of the citizens is required, nothing is more natural. Nothing is more natural than that they would be very cautious. They would be very cautious in commencing such a poor game. They would be very cautious because they would decree for themselves, for themselves all the calamities of war. They would decide a war which might have negative consequences. Among these calamities, among the latter would be, I quote, having to fight. The citizens would have to fight themselves as soldiers, at least the male citizens. Remember, 1795, the French Revolution had introduced the compulsory conscription, the compulsory drafts of every male elder than 18 years old. So citizens would have to fight as soldiers. They would have to pay the costs of war because of the rise of taxes to finance the war. They would have to painfully repair the vast devastations, destructions that war leaves behind. Since the war, in the case takes place in your country, your own country will be destroyed. So you will have to repair this. And last but not least, they would have to load themselves with a heavy national debt. That is to say, the war is financed thanks to a debt, which will have to be paid by later generations. In other words, it would be foolish for citizens to permit their democratically elected governments to go to war because of these negative consequences. And of course, the exact opposite is true in non-republican, in non-democratic, we could say in autocratic regimes. On the other hand, I go on, I start quoting again, on the other hand, the difference with a republic. In a constitution which is not republican, but in a constitution which is not republican, under which the subjects are not citizens by definition. In an autocratic regimes, there are no citizens, there are only subjects. That is to say, individuals submitted to, subjugated by their autocratic government. Under which the subjects are not citizens, a declaration of war is the easiest thing in the world to decide upon. It is very easy for an autocratic leader to go to war because, and here then is the explanation, because war does not require of the ruler, who is the owner of the state and not a member of the state. Such a war does not require of the ruler the least sacrifice of the pleasures of his table, the chase, his country houses, his court functions, and the like. In other words, it is not the autocratic ruler who will suffer privately from the negative consequences of wars. He will not have to fight. He will not have to pay. He will not have to repair the destructions. Because these destructions, these higher taxes, and the risks to die would be, by definition, have to be supported by the subjects who are not citizens and not by the ruler himself. So in such an autocratic regime, it is possible for the ruler to decide to go to war as on a pleasure party for the most trivial reasons. And this ruler would, with perfect indifference, leave the justification of this war to the diplomatic corps, to the diplomats who are always ready to provide such a justification. So Kant puts forward the idea that there is an inherent radical difference when it comes to foreign policy behavior between democracies on the one hand and autocracies on the other hand. Democracies are peace-prone, autocracies are war-prone. In putting forward this idea, Kant, when he put forward this idea in 1795, was absolutely the only one in the history of political thought to be thus optimistic regarding the peace-proneness of democracies. Of course, realist thinkers of the past did not share this idea. And some of them went even as far as considering democracies or republics in the past to be prospectively more war-prone, more expansionist, more likely to go to war than non-democracies. This is the case of Thucydides, because he ascribes, we saw this in another chapter, the Peloponnesian War to the expansionist ambitions of Athens, and Athens was the ultimate democratic city-state in the then ancient Greece. Sparta, the target, the adversary of Athens' expansionism, was an aristocratic regime, so less democratic. And the same idea was shared by Machiavelli when he analyzed not the Italian city-states of the Renaissance period of the 14th or 15th century, but when he analyzed the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic, you know, that was at the origin of the Roman Empire. So there could have been no Roman Empire without a Roman Republic behaving in a very expansionist, aggressive way towards the neighboring territories. And the idea of democracies being at least as war-prone as non-democracies is also shared by Alexander Hamilton, one of the three Federalists, who wrote in the Federalist number 6, this is what he wrote: have republics, he also uses the term republics, have republics in practice been less addicted to war than monarchies, the opposition between republics and monarchies, monarchies being autocratic regimes, have republics been less addicted to war? Are not republics administered by men as much as monarchies? The nature of men explains war. He's a classical realist. Hobbes put forward the same idea. So it's not a question of political regime. Are there not, in a democratic regime, in a republic, are there not aversions, predilections, rivalries, and desires of unjust acquisitions that affect nations as much as kings? Popular regimes are likely to be tempted to desire unjust acquisitions through war as much as kings. Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, of resentment, of jealousy, of avarice, and other irregular and violent propensities? Popular assemblies, that is to say democratic regimes, according to Hamilton, are as likely as monarchies or autocratic regimes to be tempted to go to war. So realist scholars preceding Kant did not share his analysis, and liberal scholars before Kant did not either consider democracies or republics to be peace-prone. They preferred, we saw this in our two previous chapters, they preferred either the peace through interdependence thesis, economic interdependence, Montesquieu, or the peace through international institutions, idea, Locke and Grotius. So the first liberal thinker, and he's not a thinker strictly defined, who will agree with Kant, was Woodrow Wilson, more than one full century after Kant. During World War I, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, I say he's a liberal thinker because his ideas were liberal and he had been a teacher, a professor at Princeton before becoming America's president. So President Wilson is he who rediscovered 120 years after Immanuel Kant the idea that democracies are, to quote his discourses, peace-loving nations. You know that he decided that America should join World War I in order to help the French and the British in danger of being defeated by the autocratic Imperial Germany and its Austrian ally. So he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. This is the discourse that he held on April 2, 1917, when he had to justify to the American public opinion and to the American representatives why he changed his mind, why he could no longer permit America to remain neutral as he had promised when he was elected at the eve of World War I. So this is what he said, and here we have the typical justification of the typical hypothesis of democracies being peace-loving nations, peace-prone regimes. Self-governed nations, listen to Wilson, self-governed nations do not fill their neighbors with spies. They do not set the course of intrigue to bring about some critical posture of affairs which will give them an opportunity to make conquest. So democratic regimes do not look for more or less artificial reasons or pretexts to conquer their neighbors. Such designs, such aggressive plans can be successfully worked out only undercover in secret, where no one has the right to ask questions. And by definition, in a democracy, everyone has the right to ask questions. Cunningly contrived plans of deception, plans of aggression, can be worked out and kept from the light only within the privacy of courts, monarchical regimes, or behind the carefully guarded confidences of a narrow and privileged class in a state where a narrow, small minority rules. Their secret decisions, in general, and secret foreign policy decisions are likely to be taken. This is not possible in a democratic regime. Listen to Wilson. These plans of aggression are happily impossible where public opinion commands, where public opinion insists upon full information concerning the nation's affairs. There where citizens rule, secret is impossible. And his last sentence, the conclusion: a steadfast counsel for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. Peace can only emerge and prevail, thanks to an association of democratic nations, because autocracies are not peace-prone. In the contemporary literature, there are some analysis, there are some researches upon the dictatorships, war proneness, for instance, Jessica Weeks' book, Dictators at War and Peace. But the vast majority is dedicated to the positive claim of Kant or Wilson: democracies do not go to war. So, in the history of political thought, Kant and then Wilson. In the discipline of international relations, which starts 2 years after Wilson's speech, 1919, in Aberystwyth in Great Britain, before becoming a somehow typical American social science. In the discipline of international relations, the idea that democracies should be peace-prone was not shared at the very beginning of the discipline. I just mentioned one author, Quincy Wright, 1942, the first edition of his study of war. You have the reference in the bibliography of the introductory chapter. Quincy Wright rejects the idea of a positive link between a democratic regime and peace. Listen to him. Statistical findings do not corroborate the idea that democracies have been less often involved into wars than non-democracies. There is no empirical corroboration of the peace-proneness of democracies. Probably, this is the conclusion, there are tendencies in favor of peace and war, both in democracies and in non-democracies. So no impact at all of the democratic regime or the political domestic regime in general, no impact of the domestic political regime of a state upon said state's foreign policy behavior. It can be either peaceful or not. whatever, the regime. So it's a typical realist claim. Remember, you know that according to realists, it is either human nature or the international structure, the anarchical structure that shapes the foreign policy behavior of the state, not its domestic regime. So in the discipline of international relations, no, absolutely no Kantian approach up to the 60s. Up to the 60s, when an American scholar, it's the first one whose article I mentioned in today's bibliography, Dean Babst, published an article called A Force for Peace, A Force for Peace, 1964. And this is what he claims: no war has ever been waged among independent governments independent nations whose governments were democratically elected. No war ever was waged among nations whose governments were elected democratically. First claim. Second statement: given there is a growing number of democracies, I mentioned this at the beginning of today's class, given there is a growing number, an increasing number of democracies, I quote, democracy is becoming a force for peace, a force for peace, and this is the title he gave to his article, A Force for Peace. Dean Babst, however, the article was published in a regional American journal called the Wisconsin Sociologist. Babst was not an international relations scholar. So his analysis was unnoticed during some time. Although also it was not published in International Relations Journal. You know that social sciences are divided into departments: political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, international relations, etc., etc. And scholars hardly look at what colleagues in other disciplines than their discipline are publishing or not. Anyway, so Babst's claim was not noticed by the international relations discipline, and therefore only when the very first quantitative research projects were launched, it was only at that moment that the possible link between domestic political regimes and war or peace-prone behavior on the international scene, it was only at that time that this link was somehow scientifically studied. And this was the case, notably, when David Singer and Melvin Small launched their Currents of War project, whose aim was to produce a lot of quantitative data upon wars that took place from 1815 up to the 1960s and the 1970s. These scholars asked a lot of questions. How many wars did occur? How long did they last? Which state did initiate them? Which states did win or lose said wars? And also, what was the political regime of states involved in the different wars? And this last point, of course, permitted to put the emphasis upon a possible or not link between domestic political regimes and foreign policy behavior. So Singer and Small looked at the wars that occurred in the period going from 1815 to 1965, 150 long years, so very significant, statistically speaking, for a social science. They included in their research international wars strictly defined, that is to say, opposing independent units, independent nation states among each other, but they also included what they called extra systemic wars, that is to say, colonial wars. Colonial wars opposed an independent state, France, Great Britain, to, by definition, non-independent colonial territories. So their sample of wars, the sample of wars that they analyzed, permitted them to come to the following conclusions. Democracies were involved during the period in as many wars as non-democracies. Democracies go as often to wars as non-democracies. First claim. The wars where democracies got involved were less bloody, but they lasted longer, in average, than wars where no democracies were involved. Democracies did as often initiate a war as they were the target of an attack by a non-democratic state. If democracies did not go to war during the period, it was for the very simple reason that they had no common borders with other democracies. In other words, it is the absence of territorial contiguity, of geographical proximity. We saw this in chapter 4, as far as I remember, which explains the absence of war among democracies. It is not the fact for them to be democracies that explains that they did not go to war against each other. So all in all then, the general conclusion drawn by Small and Singer and Small, was the following one: democracies, I quote, have not been peace prone, during the studied period 1815-1965. Non-elected governments, that is to say autocratic regimes, do not monopolize aggressive and useless wars. And the last sentence, we cannot share, Singer and Small, we cannot share the optimistic conclusion relative to the positive link between democracy and peace. There is no such positive link, correlation between democracy and peace. Democracies are not behaving more peacefully than other non-democratic states. This is the finding of the first significant, important quantitative research project, the Correlates of War. But as usual in the discipline of international relations, when one scholar or one project finds a result, someone is looking for the opposite. And an opposite result indeed was found a bit later by another American scholar, Rudolf Rummel. He published a short article. I put it in the bibliography. Rudolf Rummel, Libertarianism and International Violence, published in 1983, the beginning of 1980. He analyzed a very short period, 5 years, 1976 to 1980. 1976 to 1980, the article was published in 1983. So he, by definition, only includes wars among states, interstate wars. There were no more colonial territories at the end of the 1970s. And he drew the two following general conclusions. He used the term libertarian regimes. We can establish an equivalence with liberal democratic regimes. Libertarian systems mutually preclude violence, which amounts to saying, I quote, that violence occurs between states only if at least one is non-libertarian. Only at least one must be non-democratic in order for a war to break out. And the second general conclusion is that freedom inhibits violence. The more states are free, liberal, democratic, or libertarian, the more they're likely to be peaceful. Freedom inhibits violence. The more libertarian a state, the less it tends to be involved in violence, the less it tends to be involved in violence. So we have two research programs, both relying upon quantitative data. It's not a qualitative analysis, it is a quantitative research based on statistical findings. And yet they arrive to absolutely perfectly opposite conclusions. No peace proneness according to of democracies, according to Singer and Small. the more libertarian, the more peace, according to Rummel. So at first sight, the two researches are incompatible, but if you look at the methodological characteristics, differences, we immediately see that they are not that different. First difference is the time period, 1815, 1965 versus 1976 to 1980. So 150 years on one hand, only 5 years on the other. The second difference is that single and small do include all the international wars, including colonial ones. And by definition, there are no more colonial wars, and therefore, during the period analyzed by Rummel, therefore he only focuses on strictly defined interstate wars. If then we combine the two methods used by single and small on the one hand and Rudolf Rummel on the other hand, and this is what Steve Chan did. Steve Chan, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, are the freer countries more Pacific? Have a look at the bibliography. This is what Steve Chan did. If we merge the two methodological specificities into one single framework, that is to say, if we look at the period going from 1815 to 1980, the full period and significance of 165 long years, and if we focus only on interstate wars strictly defined among independent sovereign nation states, excluding therefore the colonial wars that were very frequent during the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, then we can come to the conclusion that yes, indeed, there are no wars opposing democracies to one another, but democracies go on waging wars against non-democratic states. And this is how Steve Chan sums up this idea: political freedom erects a mutual barrier between democracies, but a barrier preventing wars to break out. But it does not have the same effect on democracies when democracies are dealing with non-democracies. I repeat, peace prevails among democracies, but democracies are not peaceful when behaving with non-democracies. And it is to this conclusion that at the same time, another American scholar, Michael Doyle, arrives independently from these statistical quantitative researches because he's a philosopher. He started as a philosopher before being more and more gradually interested in international relations. Michael Doyle arrives in 1983 in his very famous article to the same conclusion. The article is published in this book, which is a collection publishing the most important articles, favorable or not, to the democratic peace theory by the American journal International Security. So Michael Doyle's article, Kant, and he refers to Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs, is reproduced in this collection, which, I repeat, presents the whole debate that was very vivid throughout the 80s and 90s about in the United States discipline of international relations. So Michael Doyle arrives exactly at the same conclusion. Democracies do not fight against each other. In other words, they have been able to establish a separate zone of peace. The state of war, however, still prevails in any other relations, that is to say, both when democracies deal with non-democracies and, of course, when non-democracies have relations with non-democracies. Michael Doyle is considered, rightly so, to be the somehow genuine founding father of the contemporary version of the democratic peace theory. Why? Because beyond the mere empirical research, he is interested in providing an explanation, a theoretical explanation of why democracies are peaceful when dealing with one another and why they are not peaceful when dealing with non-democratic states. So he's the founding father of the contemporary version of the democratic peace theory, and his explanation basically rests upon Immanuel Kant's approach, and this is the reason why he called his article Kant, Liberal Legacies and Foreign Affairs. Listen to Doyle explicitly referring to Immanuel Kant. Liberal states are different. They are indeed peaceful, yet they are also prone to make war. Liberal states have created a separate peace as Kant would have argued. Remember what Kant said? Peace is possible when the state's constitution is republican and when the states, all the civil constitutions of states will be republican. So as long as not all the states are republics, those who are peaceful with one another. So liberal states, I go on quoting Doyle, have created a separate peace as Kant would have argued that they would, and they have also discovered reasons for aggression as Kant feared they could. He makes allusions to the secondary or preliminary articles of the Perpetual Peace, which I did not mention because I will come back to them in the second semester. Anyway, they are exactly acting the way Kant imagined that they would act. And therefore, they are different from what both Machiavelli and Schumpeter said when talking about republics. Unlike, I go on quoting, unlike Machiavelli's republics, Kant's republics are capable of achieving peace among themselves. They are capable of achieving peace among themselves. Why? And here's the explanation. Because they are able to appreciate the international rights of other republics whose international rights derive from the representation of their individuals. In other words, according to Doyle, republics, and this is his major explanation, democracies are peaceful among each other because they are based on the same values, and the most important value is that democratic regimes respect the basic human rights of their citizens. Foreign citizens of a foreign democracies, I quote, are our moral equals. Since they are our moral equals, democracies have no possibility to justify a prospective decision to go to war against other democracies, because these other democracies do also, by definition, respect the basic human rights of their own citizens, just as we in our democracies are doing. Unlike Schumpeter's capitalist democracies, because according to Schumpeter, capitalist democracies in general were peaceful, just as according to Machiavelli, democracies in general were not peaceful. And here then is the specificity of Kant, who permits to be distinguished both, to distinguish the behavior of democracies both from what Machiavelli said, no specificity of democracies, and what Schumpeter said, yes, a peaceful specificity of the democracies, of capitalist democracies. Unlike Schumpeter's capitalist democracies, Kant republics remain in a state of war with non-republics. Why then? This is Doyle's explanation. Do democracies go on going to war against non-democracies? Because these non-democracies, by definition, do not respect the basic rights, the basic human rights of their own citizens who actually are subjects. Listen to Doyle. Kant's republics remain in a state of war with non-republics, unlike Schumpeter's capitalist democracies. Even though these wars cost more then they economically permit to gain, liberal republics are prepared to promote and protect, sometimes forcibly. Sometimes forcibly, democracies are prepared to promote democracy, private property, and individual rights overseas against non-republics which do not authentically represent the rights of their individuals and which therefore do not have the rights to non-interference. I repeat, according to Doyle, referring to Kant, democracies sometimes are tempted to go to war against non-democracies in order to spread the democratic values, and they are all the more so tempted to do so because non-democracies do not have the right to non-interference, since they, by definition, do not respect the basic rights of their own citizens. Doyle's explanation is first and foremost philosophical. It is a question of mutually shared values. It is not, I would say, a hardcore international relations discipline explanation. Such a more classical, typical international relations explanation of why democracies are peaceful among each other and why they go to war against non-democracies, such a more disciplinary explanation was put forward by the second major author of the democratic version in its contemporary, the democratic peace theory in its contemporary version, that is to say, Bruce Russett, in his Grasping the Democratic Peace, published in 1993. Bruce Russett had been a student of Karl Deutsch, who put forward the concept of security communities. We'll come back to this concept in our next chapter, dealing with somehow constructivist approaches. And his PhD dissertation had focused on the so-called special relationship between the US and Great Britain. This is important. Why? Because Bruce Russett, when analyzing why democracies do not go to war against each other, goes back to the origin, the chronological origin of the tendency of democracies to find peaceful solutions to their conflicts in the strict neutral meaning of the term, divergent interests, divergent aspirations. So he goes back to the end of the 19th century. And he found actually two important crises that opposed then major democracies, two crises that could have escalated into a war and that actually were resolved peacefully by the democracies concerned. The first one regards precisely the special relationship, regards precisely the relationship between the US and Great Britain. It is a so-called Venezuelan crisis that broke out at the very end of the 19th century, 1894-5-6. It opposed Venezuela, an independent Latin American state, to British Guyana, which nowadays is Guyana, and which at that time was a colonial territory of the British Empire. There was a border quarrel between the two, and there was a risk of a war breaking out between the British Empire in Guyana and Venezuela, the independent Latin American state. What's more, there was a risk of America getting involved in the war. Why? Because on behalf of the Monroe Doctrine, what did Venezuela do? It appealed to the US. Please help me in my opposition, my quarrel with Great Britain, because I am unable to do so. I'm too weak to resist a prospective invasion by the British. But given that you, Uncle Sam, did put forward the Monroe Doctrine, I ask you to protect me since you claimed in 1923 that America should belong to the Americans and no longer to the Europeans. So there was a risk of a war, the crisis escalating into a war, no longer merely opposing Venezuela to Great Britain, but opposing Venezuela plus the US to Great Britain. And therefore, a risk of a war among democracies, given that the US and Great Britain at that time were two democracies, though Venezuela was not. This crisis, ladies and gentlemen, according to Russett, was resolved peacefully. And it is precisely this capacity to find a peaceful resolution which is at the origin of the so-called special relationship. And then Russett found a second crisis that broke out 2 years later in 1898, opposing two other democracies, once again the British, but no longer the Americans, but the French. The Fashola Crisis. Fashola, a town in today's Sudan, that is to say the North African desert. Why Fashola? Because the two armies met in Fashola, given the willingness of the French to establish a continuous territory from Senegal, Dakar to Djibouti, the whole of Africa, and the willingness of the British to establish a continuous British-controlled territory from Cairo, Egypt, to Cape Town in South Africa. So the two armies were about to fight near the town of Fashola. The Fashola crisis was resolved peacefully. No war broke out. And according to Russett, this crisis is at the origin. The peaceful resolution of this crisis was at the origin of the so-called Entente cordiale, characterizing the Franco-British relationship ever since then and permitting them to be allies against Germany in World War I. So Russett starts with these two concrete crises and then he generalizes his argument. And he then proposes his own explanation of why these two crises were resolved peacefully and why ever since then democracies do not go to war against each other because they are able to find peaceful solutions. He puts forward two sets of explanations. The first set is the so-called normative or cultural explanation. According to Russett, a democracy in its domestic political life is characterized by the culture of compromise. The culture of compromise, the fact that struggles of any kind, political, economic, social struggles, are always systematically resolved peacefully. During an election in a democratic state, he or she who loses the election accepts his or her defeat. I hope this will be true for Trump or for Biden, depending on who will win. We are November 6th, so in, I guess, 24 hours or so, we should know the name of the winner of the American election. Within a democracy, then, conflicts are resolved peacefully. Conflicts opposing employers to employees, students to professors, most of the times are resolved peacefully. There is no resort to violence, hopefully. When then, I come back to Russett, when then a democracy is involved in a conflict opposing it to another democracy, the first democracy knows that the second democracy also is accustomed to resolve peacefully thanks to compromise, to dialogue, to negotiations, its own domestic conflicts. And the second democracy knows that the first democracy is always resolving its conflicts peacefully. And the second democracy knows that the first democracy knows that the second democracy practices compromise, etc., etc. In other words, each democracy can trust the other democracy and each democracy can apply almost spontaneously its political culture of compromise when it is involved in a conflict with another democracy. That is to say, it can bet on a peaceful conflict resolution. And the opposite, of course, is true when a democracy is in a conflict, involved in a conflict with a non-democracy. This non-democracy does not practice peaceful conflict resolution in its domestic political life. And therefore, the democracy cannot bet on this non-democracy also privileging peaceful conflict resolution in their international conflict. In other words, the democracy cannot afford to merely bet on the diplomat. It must take into consideration the prospective necessity to resort to the soldier. Remember, the diplomat and the soldier do represent the state on the international scene, and a soldier may be needed when the diplomat is unlikely to permit to find a solution. And therefore, sometimes the fact for a democracy involved in the conflict in the neutral term with a non-democracy, sometimes a democracy, not merely bets on the soldier, but ends up resorting to the soldier when it sees no possibility of peaceful conflict resolution. So the first set of explanation referring to the values that are shared, the values of compromise, the culture of compromise. And then there is a second set of explanation, complementary, which Russett calls the structural or institutional explanation. The structural or institutional explanation that and underlining the role of institutional constraints that characterize the decision-making process in a democracy. Imagine a democratic state involved in a conflict. Imagine the democratically elected statesman considering, should I or not go to war? Before taking the decision, yes, I will go to war, this statesman must reply to those who criticize him, those who claim we do not want war. He or she must convince the majority of representatives to accept, to adopt the war budget, because this war budget, of course, means higher taxes, etc., or a higher debt, national debt. It must convince the free press to support its decision to go to war, that is to say, to mobilize the political and the public opinion, the support of the majority of citizens, etc. In other words, to put it differently, a statesman considering to go to war cannot take this decision by surprise. It cannot take this decision by surprise. There is a certain lapse of time between a statesman considering war as a possibility and the concrete decision, yes, we will launch a war. Imagine then a democracy being involved in the conflict with another democracy. This other democracy also must respect its own institutional constraints. The first democracy knows that. The second democracy knows that the first democracy has institutional constraints to respect. And both know that the other one knows that the first and the second know, etc., etc. In other words, once again, the two democracies can bet on the other one not deciding to go to war by surprise. And if a certain lapse of time is existing, then once again, they can bet trustfully on a peaceful resolution, and there is no more need, it will be useless to consider the necessity to resort to the soldier. The opposite is true when a democracy is involved in a conflict with a non-democracy. In a non-democracy, the autocratic leader, by definition, has no free media to respect. There are no somehow generally independent elected representatives in the parliament. Nobody will dare to criticize the autocratic leader because he or she who criticizes the autocratic leader might be jailed or killed. So there is a risk of the non-democratic leader being able and being tempted to decide to go to war whenever he decides to do so. And therefore, a democracy cannot trust this non-democratic regime. The democratic state, to some extent, can even, or should even, according to Russett, take into account the possibility for the autocratic leader to profit from the democratic state trusting in a peaceful solution. Therefore, the democratic state, once again, does not exclude the necessity, the possibility, if necessary, to resort to force. And sometimes the soldier indeed is resorted to, and no longer merely the diplomat, in order to find, in this case, a violent solution rather than a peaceful one to the conflict opposing a democracy to a non-democracy. So let's sum up Bruce Russett's explanation. The two explanations that he put forward are complementary. There can be no democratic institutions. There can be no institutional constraints without democratic values. And democratic values, the culture of compromise, of course, is improved, consolidated over time thanks to democratic institutions. So according to Russett, if two democracies are behaving peacefully when dealing with each other, it's not because democracies are inherently peaceful. It's not because citizens are inherently peaceful as opposed to subjects, etc. No. It is because of what happens during the interaction among two democracies. During this interaction, I quote Russett, mutual pacific expectation emerges because, thanks to the shared values, the culture of compromise, because of the same constitutional or institutional constraints prevailing in democracies, the two democracies can trust each other. In other words, if you can trust another state, if you can rationally and reasonably know what this other state will do, or at least what it will not do, not go to war, then, chapter 4, the security dilemma will no longer exist, or at least the intensity, the degree of intensity of the security dilemma will decrease. Since you can rationally and reasonably expect the other democracy to also privilege peaceful conflict resolution means two democracies that do trust themselves because of the culture of compromise, because of the same institutional constraints, do no more need to resort to arms. The resort to weapons, to violence, is rational only as a continuation of policy by other means, by diplomatic means. If then the diplomatic means are likely to resolve the conflict, it will be foolish, irrational, and it is useless to go to war. So it is the capacity of two democracies to put their security dilemma between brackets, to put it aside, to lower, to decrease, to diminish the intensity of the generally felt security dilemma. It is this capacity which explains the peaceful interactions among two democracies. And the opposite is true when democracies deal with non-democracies. So let us sum up the democratic peace theory, both its statements, empirical, and its explanations. The democratic peace theory, let's sum up both Russett and Doyle. The democratic peace theory claims one empirical statement. Democratic states do not go to war against each other, and only against each other. This is the so-called dyadic nature of the democratic peace, as opposed to the monadic nature. The monadic nature of democratic peace would mean that democracies as such inherently, by essence, by definition, are peaceful, which is not true because they are not peaceful when dealing with non-democracies. It is only in their mutual relationships that democracies do behave peacefully. This is the empirical statement. And there are two explanations, complementary, the one due to Doyle, the other to Russett. Two democracies do not go to war against each other because they do respect each other, since they are based on the same philosophical basic values, human rights. And they do not go to war against each other because in their mutual interactions emerge a mutually shared, peaceful, pacific expectation, which permits them to privilege the diplomat rather than the soldier in order to find a solution to their conflict. And of course, this summary can be presented in a negative way. Democracies do go on waging wars against non-democracies. This is the empirical statement, and the theoretical explanations are the following one. Either because a democracy does not trust another democracy. In other words, put differently, a democracy cannot but feel threatened from a non-democratic state, or this would be Doyle's explanation, a democracy goes on being in a state of war with a non-democracy because they do not share the same values and because a democracy considers that it has the right to interfere militarily, to intervene militarily against a non-democratic state because such a non-democratic state does not respect the basic human rights of its own populations. So a theory which is very elegant, very parsimonious in social sciences and in sciences in general. A parsimonious theory is the best of any theory. That is to say, every theorist hopes one day to discover a parsimonious theory. A parsimonious theory is a theory which, thanks to one specific independent variable, is likely to explain a very huge amount of empirical events, processes, tendencies. So you know that in hard sciences, of course, the universal law of gravity is a very parsimonious theory. You know what will happen if I open my finger? One explanation, and this is true of whatever object, of whatever, wherever this takes place and whenever it takes place. One single causal explanation permits to understand a huge number of empirical processes. In social sciences, parsimonious theories are very, very rare. And since the democratic peace theory claims that it is able to explain why democracies are peaceful among each other and why they are not peaceful when dealing with non-democracies, it is a very parsimonious theory, and therefore it was very successful when it was put forward, I would say, from the mid of the 1980s onwards, very successful during 2 decades or so. Being successful, of course, it provokes some kind of jealousy by those scholars who disagree with it. In other words, it will be criticized. It will be criticized, and the criticisms raised against this theory will be of 2 kinds. The first set of criticism attacks the empirical statements. Is it true that there are no examples of wars among democracies? And the second set of explanations does accept the empirical statement. Yes, it is true that democracies do not go to war against each other, but the second set of explanations ascribes this absence of war among democracies to other factors than the democratic regime shared by 2 or more than 2 democracies. So let's have a look at these 2 sets of criticisms that were put forward during the 90s. The first set of criticism regards the absence of war. Is it true that there is no example of any democracy going to war against any other democracy? The first example, the first empirical example sometimes put forward is the one of Finland. Finland during World War II. Why? Because Finland during World War II was an ally of Nazi Germany and not of the allies, to which belonged, of course, the 2 major democracies, the UK and the US. In other words, the Finnish democracy was opposed to the American and British democracies. This criticism can be somehow easily rejected. Why? Because of the very specific context. Finland had been attacked by the USSR in the winter of 1939, after the start of World War II, and thanks to the agreement between Molotov and von Ribbentrop, the Soviet and Nazi foreign ministers, who had agreed upon the partition of East Europe. And in this secret arrangement, they had agreed upon the USSR being allowed by the Nazis to attack Finland, because Finland in the past had pretty often been considered to be a part of the Tsarist, the Russian Empire, and therefore of the Soviet Empire. So since the Soviet Union attacked Finland, and since after the Soviet Union being attacked by the Nazis, the Soviet Union became an ally of the US, by definition, Finland was in the opposite bloc alliance and not in the American-led alliance that included also the USSR. So the context is very different, very specific. And what is even more important, and this is emphasized by Russett, is that there is absolutely no one single Finnish soldier killed by an American or British soldier, and no one single British or American soldier killed by a Finnish soldier. So this exception actually is not an exception, because it is too exceptional due to the specific context to be likely to endanger the empirical validity of the democratic peace theory's empirical statement. There is another criticism that was put forward, and a bit more delicate for the democratic peace theory. The other example is Germany. During World War I, Germany during World War I was the imperial Germany. It was the empire. It was William II, Wilhelm II, who was the then emperor. And regarding democratic peace theory, what is important is that Wilson, before becoming president, when he was a professor at Princeton University, what did Wilson say? Well, in his classes, in his courses, he considered Germany to be an example of a very democratic state. A very democratic state because of its social legislation, because it was in the domain of social law. In reality, as a matter of fact, it was the most progressive in the world because, or thanks to the then very important German labor movement, the Social Democratic or somehow Marxist party. But, and this is the counter-argument of the democratic peace theorists, if indeed Germany was very democratic regarding its social laws, it was anything but democratic regarding its policy-making decision process, and above all, its foreign political decision-making process. In the domain of foreign policy, indeed, secret was prevailing, and we saw in chapter 2 or 3, as far as I remember, that the then emperor was the prisoner of a very small minority, the Junker. The Junkers, the German aristocratic, the Prussian aristocratic landowners, the caste of these landowners did monopolize the decision-making process in the domain of foreign policy, which therefore was exactly the perfect illustration of what Wilson, as a president, had called old diplomacy characterized by secrecy, as opposed to new diplomacy characterized by public opinion being informed and therefore not permitting their governments to go to war. And the democratic peace theorists profit from this criticism to improve somehow their theory by saying, well, in order for democracies not to go to war against each other, said democracies must be mature democracies. They must be consolidated democracies, and not, in other words, very young democracies. So what is a consolidated democracy? It is a democracy which is based on, of course, democratic institutions, that is to say, plural elections, a free press, a market economy, a private property institution. And it is a political regime characterized by citizens enjoying civil rights, political rights, and social and economic rights. If these rights and these institutions are existing, then a democracy can be considered to be a mature one, a consolidated one, and in this case, it will behave peacefully when dealing with another consolidated or mature democracy. And this is somehow logical. It must be, a democracy must be consolidated in order for the institutional constraints upon the governments to be efficient, in order for the culture of compromise to be spontaneously practiced. This cannot be internalized to be normal by a very young democracy. And we thus come to the third possible criticism that indeed was raised in the 1980s, in the 1990s. What about young democracies? What about democracies that are in a kind of transition period between their autocratic past and their future prospective democratic consolidation? The criticism was put forward by Mansfield and Snyder in first an article and then a book which is called Electing to Fight. Mansfield and Snyder, Electing Fight, Why Emerging Democracies Go to War. The example that they took was what happened in former Yugoslavia. You know that Yugoslavia broke out at the very beginning of the 90s, and many wars broke out opposing Serbia to Bosnia, Serbia to Croatia, Serbia to Kosovo, which was part of Serbia, etc. In other words, as long as Yugoslavia had been a communist dictatorship, no war broke out. Once they became democracies and they broke up in different independent states, they went to war against each other. Why? According to Mansfield, it is because young democracies are unable to satisfy immediately, in a very short term, all notably the material expectations of their citizens. So what are they tempted to do? The governments of these very young democracies, the governments that were elected democratically, since by definition, the autocratic regime was overthrown. What are these elected governments tempted to do? They are tempted to divert, to look for a diversion in order for their frustrated citizens to forget their material problems. And they might therefore be tempted to go to war, to launch a diversionary war. And this, according to Mansfield and Snyder, was the case in former Yugoslavia, where all the different leaders, though elected democratically and therefore more representative than the former communist regime, were tempted to wage wars, the Serbians against the Bosnians against the Serbians, the Croatians against the Bosnians, the Croatians against the Serbians, and vice versa, etc., etc. But to some extent, this criticism does not, I would say, significantly refute the democratic peace theory, since indeed, once again, the arguments in order for democracy to be peaceful when dealing with another democracy, this democracy must be consolidated. This argument is not refuted by Mansfield and Snyder's research. I would even say that this criticism permitted democratic peace theorists to put forward another argument, a more political, practical recommendation, and we'll come back to this in our second semester class. Democratic peace theory is not favorable to export democracy in order to transform a dictatorship into a democratic regime, because during the very short transition period, during the more or less short or long transition periods, this new democracy will be anything but democratic. In other words, you cannot impose by force a democracy upon a state which does not itself, a population which does not itself go through the democratization process. You cannot impose democracy from abroad. We'll come back to this in the second semester course on democracies at war. So empirically then, I would come to the conclusion that the democratic peace theory is valid. There are indeed no examples of democracies going to war against each other. I exclude here, of course, just as all the other theorists do that I mentioned, I exclude covered actions that democratic governments undertake against other democratic governments are not wars, and therefore are not taken into account in my course, which focuses on wars provoking, I said this at the very beginning of this lectures, provoking the death of at least 1,000 people. The example we can have in mind, of course, is America's secret covered action, the CIA's covered action against Chile, against Allende in Chile in 1970, 1971, 2, 3. Chile had elected democratically a socialist President Allende. This Allende was perceived to be a threat for American interests in South America, in Chile, and therefore the CIA undertook this coup, or supported the coup of Pinochet, which permitted to overthrow the democratically elected government. But it was not a war fought by the US, it was a covered action, and therefore it does not, strictly speaking, refute the democratic peace theory regarding its empirical statement. So I would say that everybody agrees nowadays upon the validity, the empirical validity of the democratic peace theory. There are no examples of democracies going to war against each other. But a second set of criticism, probably more important, focuses on the explanation. Is it true that democracies do not go to war because of there being democracies, thanks to there being democracies? And here realist scholars, of course, do disagree, and they put forward alternative explanations. The first one is Christopher Lane in a short article published in the book, in the collection of International Security Journal. This is his article of Christopher Lane, Kant or Kant. The myth of the democratic peace, the undertitle, the subtitle is more significant. Christopher Lane goes back to Russett's examples. He goes back to Russett's examples, the Fashola Crisis, the Venezuelan Crisis, and he adds two other crises opposing two democracies. He adds first the Trent Affair. The Trent Affair occurred in 1861, opposing the British to the Americans. Trent was the name of a British ship. And this British ship was seized by, during the Civil War in the US, by Lincoln's Navy, because this ship, a British ship, transported weapons that the British sold to the southern slavery states, the Confederate states that wanted to no longer be part of the US because of their sticking to slavery. There was a risk, therefore, given the outrage in Great Britain, a British ship had been seized by the American Navy. There was a risk of war opposing the US to Great Britain, just as in the Venezuelan crisis. And Lane adds a fourth empirical crisis, example of a crisis, the Ruhr crisis, opposing in the 1920s Germany to the Weimar Republic, because of France after 1918 occupying the Ruhr region, where the heavy steel and coal industries of Germany was located, in order to force the Germans to pay. And there was a risk, of course, of the Germans not accepting this kind of punishment. And this is a crisis which opposed two democracies, the French Third Republic to the Weimar Republic of Germany. Lane, of course, accepts the empirical reality, the two crises of Russett and the two crises that he adds, so the four crises together, are resolved peacefully, but he does not think that it was due to their shared democratic regime. He actually looks very concretely, undertakes concrete research analyzing the reactions of the then political classes in the US, in the UK, in Germany, in France, and the media. And what did he see? He saw that many then politicians, German, French, English, British, and many newspapers were favorable to a war. And this war was avoided. It did not occur. So why then was it avoided? Since it cannot be ascribed to the kind of peaceful, mutually shared, peaceful expectation, since by looking at the then political debate, it was anything but peaceful. A significant part of the then the members of the political classes in the States were favorable to going to war. According to Lane, well, it is a traditional explanation, a traditional realist explanation, which permits us to understand why these crises were resolved peacefully, and more specifically, the power ratio. In 1861, in 1895, Great Britain, opposed to the US, was not powerful enough or did not have the courage to go to war against the US because it was afraid of a third-party state profiting from such a war, either France in 1861 or Germany in 1895, because Germany at that time was rising and was already gradually threatening the then so-called British peace. And the same is true for France and Great Britain. In Fashola, they had an interest in finding a solution in order to avoid, once again, Germany from profiting. Germany had expressed its interest in having its own colonial part of the colonial cake in Africa. And in 1923, the Weimar Republic was too weak comparatively to the French army. And therefore, the Weimar Republic could not afford to go to war. So it's not a question of mutually shared democratic values or institutions, but it was a traditional power political consideration. The same analysis is put forward by Johann Gower and Henry Farmer. The second criticism, theoretical criticism, put forward against the democratic peace explanation of the democratic peace reality. They do analyze the Cold War period. The Cold War period, which indeed was a peaceful period regarding the relations among democracies, no wars, and no even risk of war among the US, Canada, Great Britain, Western Germany, Italy, France, etc. And how do Gower and Faber explain this democratic peace? They explain it by, of course, the specific context of the Cold War. Democracies could not go to war because of their common enemy, the USSR. They could not afford to go to war. And they were anyway not permitted to go to war against each other because of America's hegemony within the democratic camp. So it is another typical realist explanation in terms of power distribution, balance of power among France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, roughly, and of course, the power cycle theory of the US hegemonic power dictating the European democracies' behavior. You will remain in the North Atlantic Alliance in order for us together to cope with the common enemy. What should we think of these criticisms, ladies and gentlemen? It is, of course, impossible to, as usual, in international relations and social sciences, it is impossible to come to a definitive, unambiguous conclusion, who's right, who's wrong. We should remake history, which by definition is impossible. What I can say is that given the 30 years or so since the end of the Cold War, and given the fact that in 2020, no risk of any war opposing democracies exists in the contemporary world, we cannot reject easily the democratic peace theory. A good theory in international relations is a theory which explains less badly more political processes. The democratic peace theory indeed is able to explain why democracies did never go to war against each other, whatever the context. Because if we take the context of the interwar periods, no war among democracies, and actually they decided to ally in one single alliance against the Nazi threat and during the Cold War against the Soviet threats. This tends to corroborate the validity of the democratic peace theory, the theoretical validity. The democratic peace reality, the separate zone of peace among democracies, first and foremost, indeed, can be ascribed to the democratic nature of the regimes of the states concerned. Everything, however, is not that rosy regarding the democratic peace theory. Why? For the very simple reason that, given this both empirical validity and the theoretical credibility of the democratic peace theory, politicians, either directly or indirectly, that is to say, via experts and pundits, instrumentalizing or at least using academic knowledge for political purposes, these politicians, first in the US, but also beyond, in the UK and in France, discovered this theory in order to justify, to find justifications for the different wars that they launched ever since the end of the Cold War. In other words, there is a risk of academic knowledge. The democratic peace theory was proposed to refute the realist claim of a never-ending state of war among all the states, whatever their regime. The risk of academic knowledge being used politically for purposes others than the one for which they were invented or conceived by those who had the first intuition of its substantive contents. We will see, ladies and gentlemen, how the democratic peace theory was used by democracies in the wars that they have been waging since the end of the Cold War in our second semester class, Democracies at War. Before doing that, of course, we will have to have a look at the very last theory of war and peace, the one that claims both to explain why sometimes states go to war and why sometimes they are in peace, the constructivist approach in terms of security or non-security communities. We will do this next week. Thank you very much for listening today. Hope you'll be back next week, and I wish you a great day. Goodbye.